I'm Ryan. If you are new to class, I know we have a few return students or guests, uh, but happy to have you here. If you have again questions, just let me know. Beverage director at Corkbuzz, Master Sommelier through the Court of Master Sommeliers. Later, just briefly about myself. What was been really cool and that I've really enjoyed for this, it's always extended learning. And if you are a student and you're looking to learn more, one thing that I've enjoyed and it's through Wine Scholar Guild. I don't know if you can see that, but it's kind of cool. You can do little like focused accreditations. Like this is for, I have this whole manual on like Bordeaux master certification, but through it, I mean, it's like $500, but it might be something worth a try once in many of these different regions. You can do it with Bordeaux, you can do it with Burgundy, you can do it with Loire, you can do something general, just like France. But with this, I've been able to review 15 webinars just on Bordeaux from some of the top authors of the region, Jane Anson being one of them, which is kind of cool. And professionals that actually live in this area. So it's been kind of a fun way to approach this region through these instructors and hearing what they have to hear. A lot of them coming from the ground floor. Oh my gosh, you're actually going on a trip. That's amazing. Rick, welcome. Chateau Latour, Desmonts, Margaux. I wonder how that works. Latour, I'm thinking of a Pauillac producer, and then
I know.
They have a property or maybe a label or in Margaux. I'm looking at chat if you're wondering what the heck I'm talking about, where people are starting to chime in a little bit. But here, let's go ahead and share my screen. All right. Share screen. Cool. All right, everybody can see it okay?
Yep.
We're gonna play from the start. All right, I'll minimize this. Welcome, welcome. Here we go. So a first look into some of the vineyards here. This is Chateau Pontet-Canet. It's a classified fifth growth of Pauillac. They came up with this classification that we'll review. The 1855 is probably the most famous, and it strongly represents the wines of the Médoc, where we're spending the next hour. But they also classified some of the sweet wines of Sauternes further south, which we won't spend much time on today. But with this classified fifth growth, you have a ranking of 1, 2, 3, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. All very reputable wines. But fifth growth, this classification that's been in place for 150 years and not really having changed much during that period, raises a little speculation sometimes. But there are Chateau, perhaps fifth or third, that over that period of time has really raised the level or bar of quality that they've been releasing and building on their reputation. So Pontet-Canet, even though fifth, is recognized as perhaps along some of the top first grows. One of the ways that they've been able to obtain these accomplishments is they were one of the first to employ biodynamic farming. An area it's been a little bit slow maybe to in those directions of like organic and sustainable, but it's one of the strongest movers now in those directions of like healthy farming. So this is Pontet-Canet. Look at their house and their vineyards and the horse kind of as their main way of transportation as they're picking the grapes. Now, just zooming in always, here we are, we're going to be in the southwestern part of France. We are right next to the Atlantic Ocean, but in part of this huge estuary, the Gironde. So with close to 2,000 years of history, why has this place been able to develop as such a strong wine region? A lot of it was its ability for transportation and to export these wines easily, being right along the ocean and along this major estuary. Maybe just to keep moving. But here we are zooming in. One of the major wine regions of France, Bordeaux. And I guess just big picture stuff. Up here, one of the other major wine regions of France, Burgundy. For Pinot Noir further north, it's a little bit cooler. It's further inland, more continental, so better for these lighter styles of wine. Even though a little further south, here we're in a slightly warmer, more maritime influenced climate, where you can ripen wines that prefer a little more sun and heat, bring me bigger, bolder styles like Cabernet and Merlot blends. And then another map as we zoom in, this is again where we're hanging out in the Médoc on the left bank of the Gironde. Kind of just background stuff. We have the left bank here, which is pretty much everything on this left-hand side, which would include the Grave further south and even in Sauternes, essentially what's on the left side of the Gironde. And then you can see that the Gironde breaks off right around here about at Margaux, or one of our major communes, and turns into the Garonne river to the left-hand side, and then the Dordogne river to the eastern side. And then everything on the right bank of the Gironde, what major regions would be Saint-Emilion and Pomerol, major grape here being Merlot, and the blend preferring these cool clay soils. Major grape on the left bank of the Gironde would be Cabernet dominant, and that's a lot due to these warm, deep gravel soils that allow Cabernet to successfully ripen, where on these cool clay soils on the right bank would maybe be too difficult. Hence the reason Cabernet dominant, warm gravel soils, left bank where we're at, cool clay soils on the right bank, better for Merlot. Merlot usually softer, plush, velvety fruit. Cabernet usually structure and power and grip and tannins, has some power and weight to it. And just another map, it's always kind of fun just to look at maps. They certainly create context. We're going to zoom in on these communes where you even get an idea to see where a lot of these chateaus are located. And I think that helps too, just when I'm trying to reference them. And there's so many chateaus like insurance company and French conglomerate, like these major corporations that have the money to purchase some of these estates, that sometimes it gets a little lost or a little confusing to remember their significance. But sometimes just having a place to put them or recognize them on a map help again builds context and reference. But I like this one where again our Médoc up here. What's kind of fun here is that this is an all red wine region. Same with some of these major areas on the right bank, like Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. You can see these are our little purple dots that tells us that it's red wine production. And then if we go down here, continuing on the left bank, like the Grave, north of that Pauillac, well, here there's getting into sweet wine production, marked by gold far down below. And then here we can see a little bit of red and white in the northern parts. Just a mix of bulk production, entre deux mers, between our two rivers, between the two seas, where you find a lot of value drinking Sauvignon Blanc. And if any wine is released as just like a Bordeaux AOP, essentially that it could be coming anywhere from in this large region that we see on the map. Chances are a lot of even Bordeaux red would be coming from entre deux mers, but it would be labeled as Bordeaux entre deux mers value whites. And then just a little bit, it can outline areas where you might produce red and white, but just to kind of get a little brave visual, I guess, reference for production and what's happening where. But we're all over here and it's all red wine. And then a slight overview of what's to come. We will look at history, but then just going into, which will bring us to our classifications, which is always kind of like a daunting list, or it doesn't have to be that way. When we first started doing the Zoom classes, and Laura was one of the first to do Bordeaux, and she's going through all the classifications, and then there's just a point where she's like, oh my gosh, I feel like the most boring teacher ever. And it almost can feel like that way sometimes, but it's kind of nice that we get to just focus in on the classifications that are relevant to the Médoc. And this is all Médoc, excluding 1855. So when we go to the right bank, we'll look at Saint-Emilion. When we go to our third class, we'll look at the classification of Grape. But here we're just going to focus on what's relevant to this region, which is the 1855. If it's not a part of this huge 1855 famous classification, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, how can you promote themselves? There's been a historic labeling called Cru Bourgeois or bougie wines, and then also smaller artisanal production, Cru Artisan. So there are other ways Château with less notoriety are able to promote themselves through labeling. Going into the grapes of Bordeaux, so we have an idea of how they play off each other in the blend and just how they're planted. Major farming practices or viticulture and winemaking practices, vinification of the Medoc, and maybe look at that how it compares differently to other areas of Bordeaux. And then these are our 8 appellations that we see here in the Medoc. Medoc is, you can, if it's actually from up in this area in the north, where it's just kind of highlighted here, that's specifically Medoc, but it's an overarching designation that encompasses this entire area. So essentially, if you had a wine from the Medoc, it could be coming from anywhere that's in the purple. If it's specifically up here, it's only for the Medoc, but it's an overarching, usually more affordable styles if it would be the Medoc. And then once we get into this lighter pink area, we can see that this is the Haut Medoc. Still rather large, but slightly higher in elevation, moving down the river closer to the town of Bordeaux. You can see Bordeaux is kind of the anchor here, or the border of our Medoc region. So it's just slightly higher elevations, maybe more evidence of these gravel mounds that kind of create this area, usually leading to slightly higher quality wines, the Haut Medoc. So just higher elevations further down river, depending on how you want to look at it. And then just our major famous communes were our 18.5 classified gross are usually at home. This is our Saint Estephe, Pauillac, moving south, Saint Julien, and Margaux. Not on the map, this one in front of us, we have our outline AOPs, Listrac and Moulis, which would be right here. We'll have another picture of those in a moment. Big picture stuff really quick. Just takeaways. So if we forget about everything else in the next hour, what we always want to remind ourselves, Pauillac is where we find the deepest gravel mounds, best for Cabernet. Again, warm gravel soils that help reflect heat to ensure ripening, but also these deep gravel mounds are also great for draining water. And in a rather humid area, it's good for those wines to kind of compete for the water and allow it to grow its roots deep and search for those nutrients and primarily the water, but that allows for concentration of fruit. So Pauillac, with the deepest gravel mounds, usually produces the wines of most concentration and the wines of most power, and where the wines are oftentimes based on a higher majority of Cabernet Sauvignon in the blend. Again, these are areas wines built off blends. So Pauillac, power, okay? You're looking at the wine list, you see Saint Estephe, you see Pauillac, you see Saint Julien, and you see Margaux. I don't know what to drink. I haven't tried any of the Châteauxs. What's one thing I remember? Oh yeah, Pauyac's got the deep gravel mounds that gives me these wines that have a higher portion of Cabernet and the wines with most power, okay? We actually now, if we move further south, the opposite of Pauillac in Margaux, kind of at the like where these rivers, the Dordogne and the Garonne meet to form the Gironde, we have a lot of these like fine gravels opposed to these large gravels. And because of these fine gravel soils on top of what it seems to here mostly as clay subsoils, Margaux is elegant. It's a little bit lighter, it's a little bit prettier, it's a little more soft and kind of floral expression. Maybe starting to see a little bit more low in the blends. But if Pauillac is power, Margaux is elegance and like a lightness and kind of prettier style, okay? Saint Julien has always kind of talked about what it's not. It's not quite the power of Pauillac, and it's not quite the elegance of Margaux. It's our little Goldilocks region where we have the best of all worlds, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper from there. Saint Estephe, lastly, of our 4 major communes, being further north, what we actually have over here on the left-hand side of the Medoc, because we have the Atlantic here to the west, they have these, the lawn forest, and it acts as a barrier to kind of help protect these vineyards from this these Atlantic influences. Well, we have less of these lawn forests as we move further north. So Saint Estephe being closer to the Atlantic, less protected by these forests on the west, and even having higher portions of clay in the soil moving away from this gravel, the wines can be a little more rustic and a little more Merlot dominant comparatively to what we see with the other major communes. So sometimes, yeah, like maybe a little more reserved, a little more rustic, a little bit earthier compared to the power, Pauillac, compared to the elegance of Margaux. And then here we have our Goldilocks area of St. Julien, just really quickly. And then before we get into some of these bullet points, I like to kind of have an idea of what it might be like if you were to go visit. This is the town of Bordeaux. You can see it's right along the river. And there's these beautiful parkways where just my experience, those are groups of like friends hanging out and like 10 or 50, crowd of 10 or 15, and everybody's just drinking wine and enjoying food and each other's company. And it's just really pretty how well kept these like parks are, I suppose. Some kids playing in the town center. And then I kind of like this picture here too. We can see how the vines, they hang relatively low to the ground. And again, just absorb that heat that's obtained through the afternoon sun to help ensure ripening. And then you can see that they manage the canopy, so there is constant airflow to prohibit too much humidity from development, which would keep you from the grapes from developing frost. So they're well aerated and also close to the ground where they can help absorb some of that afternoon heat. Just a quick way of looking at that. Here we go into the history. I put a little bit more background onto this since this is the first of a 3-part series, but it goes back about 2,000 years. Before it took the name of Bordeaux, it actually had the name of Burdigala, and that was thanks to this Celtic tribe known as Bertariges Biviski that had resided in this area about 3rd century before the Common Era. So about 2,300 years ago. The town of Burdigala is well established as like a tin trade. Again, kind of an area of commerce, I suppose. But 5th century CE, Burdigala becomes the capital city of the Roman province of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is essentially this area that we see here in southwestern France. And with the help of the Romans, walls are built. I think of Saint-Emilion on the right bank, but this is wonderful fortified city built as hundreds of years ago. But commerce expands, and with Romans, vines are being planted. So further establishing the area, Burdigala. But post-Romans, 2nd, 3rd century AD, we have waves of Germanic invaders, the Vandals, the Visigoths, but it was the first king of France, Clovis, that expels these Visigoths, inherits the city of Burdigala, and now changes its name to Bordeaux, and it becomes what is kind of the beginnings of France, and emerges as an important port of trade. So when it finally takes the name of Bordeaux, thanks to King Clovis, first king of France, they do a good job of not being overtaken by invaders from that period of time, if they're Arabic or what have you. But the major next step would be the influence of Eleanor of Aquitaine. She resided and kind of ruled over this area in the 12th century, and she married the king of France at the time, where Aquitaine became a part of France. Over time, that marriage was annulled, where then she went to marry the Henry Plantagenet, who was Henry II, that was soon to become the King of England. So Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry Plantagenet, which then soon after became a King of England. So now Aquitaine, or this area of Bordeaux, also becomes a part of England, away from France. So it was a 300-year period of time where Bordeaux, thanks to this marriage, was actually a part of England. And that's a big thing where we start to see Bordeaux really become an area of export, and these wines are starting to be recognized and enjoyed outside of this area of France. Maybe more international recognition. Okay, but that it was a hugely part of its history, 300 years, And you also hear these clarets, C-L-A-I-R-E-T, because if you see C-L-A-R-E-T without the I, it references the common day red blends. But for this little chunk of history, this claret, C-L-A-I-R-E-T, represents these almost deep style rosés, maybe perhaps due to the way that the vineyards are planted and not understanding fermentation, but that got to be really, really popular in England at that time. These like deep style rosés called clarets. But moving on, what ended this rule was this in the conclusion of this 100 Years' War that came in 1453, where then Bordeaux then becomes a part of France. And then from there, the 1600s, Bordeaux is now back a part of France. We see the influence of the Dutch. And then this is really big where Médoc comes into play, because all this time, Bordeaux or the Médoc, this is all marshland. It's kind of like swampland. So there wasn't what the Dutch did, and they did this a lot in the Netherlands, and it was the King of France at the time in the late 1500s that actually commissioned the Dutch to do that, which was just draining the land through these certain channels they called gels that removed the area of its water and unearthed all these gravel mounds that it has become so famous for today. But that was only about 400 years ago. So up until that point, with this 2,000-year history, Médoc only became a place of influence around the 1600s, the time when the Dutch built these channels, which removed a lot of this water, unearthing these gravel mounds that have done so well for these grapes and what is planted there today. Okay, so that makes sense. They did prefer sweet wines. Why Sauternes started to become so popular, and they also started to plant a lot of white grapes in other areas because they wanted to use these wines for distilled products. But what we need to know is how Médoc was established. 1663, Samuel Pepys, this English writer, mentions Haut-Brion. Haut-Brion is one of these classified first growths, but this is the first time we're starting to see recognition of single chateau, some of these famous estates that we now know today. In the 1700s, noble aristocrats built chateau on the Médoc and established serious vineyards. So Dutch unearthed all these gravel mounds. Oh, there's all this new area for agriculture. Vines are being planted, and now we have this like new investment by these noble aristocrats, and these chateaus are really seeing their the beginnings of their development. 1855, Napoleon III commissions classification of top Bordeaux estates. So what was happening is they're having this universal international trades fair in Paris, and they weren't even going to submit anything at the time, but they heard that Burgundy was going to showcase some of their wines at this event. So then they're like, holy cow, we had to promote the wines of Bordeaux. So they asked these courtiers, these brokers, to come up with a ranking of these chateaux, so they had a way of promoting them. Well, they did it in like a month period of time, but then it became this classification that has now existed for like 150 years. But it was really just based off of the current, I guess, sales prices, the top estates at that time. There are a few classifications that had been kind of put together throughout the 100 years prior to that, and all what had really dictated first, second, third, fourth, or fifth was the current prices that those estates were going for. That's what we still see today. 57 chateaux selected for red. The one not included would be Haut-Brion, which is actually further south in the Grave. So we won't talk about that Haut-Brion on the first mentions. And then again, they did do it for Sauternes, but that is for a later class. So we're off to a good start. These wines are being praised and recognized and getting all this notoriety. But then we have this like triple threat of viticultural hazards. Two of them are fungal diseases, all coming from the Americas, that kind of put a hiccup in your farming. The biggest one is phylloxera that destroyed 2/3 of all world's vineyards. This is that little root louse that they had to eventually figure out how to regraft their vines, just taking disease American rootstock, planting that in the ground, and then cutting, taking vine cuttings of your European rootstock, your wine growing grapes, like Merlot or Malbec or Cabernet. And then you're taking those cuttings, those canes, cutting a little sliver in your disease-resistant rootstock. I think a lot of you know what this means for grafting, but it was actually a big thing. That cutting, put in that disease-resistant rootstock, you wrap a wire around it, a rope around it, and it's going to grow the same, perhaps Merlot or Cabernet that you had before, but now it's safe against phylloxera because it's on this American rootstock with the same bit of spinifera grapes that you had before. But this kind of redirected the way things that were planted pretty darn quickly because some grapes were better adapted to grafting where others were not. One of the ones that did better or continued to grow well was Merlot. So you start to see things, the way things were planted a little bit differently. One of the reasons for that was what grapes took better to grafting on American rootstock. And this used to be vineyards that were just kind of co-planted with multi different varieties. From that point of post-phylloxera, they started doing single plots planted monovarietal, and that's how it kind of characterizes them today. So it changed this way of like multiple different grapes in the vineyards into like single parcel plots planted to, or plots planted to single varietals. It's probably the better way of saying that. Little sidetrack note to this, like in that time of the 1855 classification, how Malbec used to be so much more widely planted. I know one of the top estates, if it was Lafitte or Tour, actually based off Malbec during that time of the classification. And what else was I just gonna say that was kind of fun? Oh, also Cabernet, the maiden grape that we have here, and like one of the most planted grapes in the red grapes in the whole world. It actually has a pretty young history. It only really started to pop its head up in the 1700s. And it was from how the two parental grapes of Cabernet Sauvignon, chat time, I'm sure some of you know what they are. One is Cabernet Franc and one is Sauvignon Blanc. Well, it's because of these grapes that were planted together randomly in the vineyards where that crossing took place, where Cabernet Sauvignon eventually started to appear in documentation. And that was only about 300 years ago or so. All right. So after they figured out how to graft, they start replanting their vineyards. You know, we do have World War I. We do have these issues of fraud where people were starting to even source fruit from not even just other places of France. It would be like the Languedoc. They were, I think, even going as far back as like Turkey just to build these, to source this fruit to supply the rising demand. And then they came up with the establishment of the AOC system, controlled appellation of origin, where all these communes that we see on our map and that we're discussing today were officially recognized in 1936. That says that the fruit must come from this area. It determines what grapes can be planted, how close you can plant them, the yields, and even alcohol levels to protect a level of quality. Well, right after this, we have World War II. Okay, when that ends in 1945, it took a little bit while for this area to rebuild. And as soon as they were getting their feet back, we had this incredible frost, this deep freeze that destroys again about a third. Well, I have a fourth of the vines here. That's all over Bordeaux. But where Malbec used to be more heavily planted, a lot of that again was ripped up to replant to other varietals, and that might be more of how they behaved where they're less susceptible to frost. Merlot being another example of that, maybe another reason for its rise in plantings. Cool, well, we got past the frost and the freeze of 1956. 60s and 70s, you know, it was more of conventional farming, and they really, again, had experienced some much more difficult vintages. So we only have one or two vintages in the 60s and 70s that maybe saw some success. Again, this is maritime influence. There's a lot of humidity in the area, and for you to have a successful, like, warm year with healthy grapes came kind of few and far between. But then we have the 80s, and with 82, that monumental vintage, we have Robert Parker. That said that this is going to be one of the most outstanding vintages that people talk about. And of course, that exactly became the case later on, not so much at the time, but one reason why he eventually gained his notoriety. And that was this kind of what became the golden era of Bordeaux. In the 90s, you saw a lot of Parkers known for perhaps scoring wines that are big and lush and round and ripe, higher points. So in the 90s, kind of the offset of this, we saw the rise of the garage wine movement in more in like areas of the right bank, San Emilion and Pomerol, where just like smaller producers, but producing big, full, lush, ripe wines, started gathering all these high points. But again, just this overall accumulation of high prices with these chateaus recognized through high points and certain scores. Well, when everybody was getting used to paying a lot of money for these big, full, like collectible chateau, we have the 2008 economic crash, where then people all of a sudden were maybe reconsidering the price of they wanted to spend on wine on a regular basis. And then perhaps we started seeing new wave California and small A's leaning towards wines of perhaps more affordable costs and wines that are meant for everyday consumption. So it's seen kind of a little bit of a backlash and a point of time where they're now like, well, let's actually focus on how we're farming and considering our vineyards and kind of trying to re-promote themselves in a different way, where it's not this stodgy, like stiff kind of wine region, that there's a lot of cool, innovative things going on, and it's exactly the truth. Oh boy. You guys doing all right? You guys drinking some Cabernet dominant blends besides Rick? All right, so this is our classification. Left bank, exception is Aubryon and Sauterne. Okay, it's based on price and reputation at the time. We only saw one or two changes. One was Cantamaril, it's a fifth growth that was recognized shortly afterwards. This lady that was the head of the state petitioned in 55, and then it was recognized in 56. But the big one here is Mouton, that was upgraded to first growth in 1973. And it's always cool, like they always have a different artist that gets commissioned to do the labels from year to year. I always have it on my slides. We'll see in a little bit. You guys know who the artist who did the label for Mouton in 73? If you attend my classes, you do. Pablo Picasso. He did the artwork for their label when it was upgraded to first growth. So now there are 5, but it started as 4 first growths. This is the big boy. Here's our Cru Bourgeois. It has history going back a few hundred years, where it was like these townsmen that were known to produce quality wines from their certain chateau, but eventually were just the chateau that remained outside of this classification. So they did do this as a way to, again, promote themselves. There are labels in the Cru Bourgeois system. It's been off and on for a number of years. It's back and official as far as 2020. But if it's not just Cru Bourgeois, there's exceptional, superior, and then standard Cru Bourgeois label. It's kind of tricky. That should tell you if one is better than the other. You can see that we have the fewest amount of exceptional. The top estate's 14 now, 56 superior, and then on 179 that just categorize the remaining third tier. But some of these top estates, well, what is happening was overall Cru Bourgeois wines were decreasing in price point. So some of the chateaux that maybe qualified for exceptional, they just removed themselves from the system because they feel like from their reputation that they're going to command a higher price, get a higher price point for their chateau than if they were to be in this overall Cru Bourgeois designation, where everything is at the slightly lower tier from maybe where they're at. Anyway, it's just an ongoing thing, and where they've reestablished themselves. We'll see how it works for them, but it may be another way of trying certain producers if you're not familiar. And then the artisan one, again, is just recognizing, I mean, they're doing everything themselves, from the farming to the winemaking, just wines that recognize small producers. Today there's 36, and it's an official designation since 2002, being the first vintage. And then this is an important one. This LiveX classification, where the 1855 is just in place, and it's been the same over the last 150 years. This began in 2009, and it's based in England, in London, and they review chateaus I guess, current reputations, and they build a classification based on that. So that's where you could see like classified fifth growth Pontet Canet that we started our slide with, or other fifth growths like Lynch Bage. They're recognized as top tier. So it might be a source for you if you're wondering in a way to buy towards value. Again, not first growth, which could be $1,000 on a wine list easily. Oh, I know that these states, Lynch Bage, Pontet Canet, Ducru Bucaille, Lieuville Lacasse, well, they've been some of the top performers in recent years. So where we can, another way of sourcing quality. And then outside of the Medoc, Graves has their own thing. It's just one tier, your Grand Cru Class A or not. So it's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's just you are or you're not. And what's unique, it's the only classification that has allows for red and white wines to be looked at later. And then Saint Emilion on the right bank, they also wanted a way to promote their wines because they were left out of the classification. Most of the negociants at the time of 1855 were based in Bordeaux, focusing on the wines of Medoc. So that's why the right bank was maybe left out at that time. Well, there's in Saint Emilion, originally starting in 1955, it was meant to be more fluid where they could edit it and determine their top estates at once every 10 years. Not always working out that way, but Saint Emilion is meant to be revised and re-edited. And then upcoming in 2022. So it's exciting to see what top estates of Saint Emilion remain with this new year. Little side note, there are 4 top estates in Saint Emilion. They call it Premier Grand Cru Class A. 3 of them are removing themselves from the Saint Emilion classification. So that's kind of a big deal. We'll see. This is our French wine law system that came up in 1936. You can see appellation of Margaux contrôlé, so that everything has to actually come from this region. And then we talked about this, what it can actually protect. And just where I know there's a lot of material in front of us, I might just move on. What is interesting though, is where most of these areas received that designation when the wine laws were put into place, 1936. It took Margaux, one of the most famous areas, almost close to 20 years afterwards, because Margaux is based off of, it overlaps 5 communes. And then all these producers in these 5 communes were kind of trying to decide what chateau, what communes would be included in the overarching Margaux appellation. So it took them 20 years to actually figure it out and decide and agree upon what would, my cat's hanging out with us, be recognized as Margaux. Okay, so Merlot is actually it is the most planted grape in all of Bordeaux, and that's even true now more and more with even on the left bank side, we're seeing it more and more and being used in the blends. But again, it adds the softness to Cabernet's texture, structure. Again, Cabernet's got the backbone, Merlot gives the plum, soft, fruited, kind of velvety textures and characteristics. And it's also not only the way that they complement each other in the blend, but Cabernet being later ripening, Merlot is earlier ripening. So if you do have a difficult year and you don't get that Cabernet ripened to the point that you want, you're okay because your Merlot is all successfully harvested and you can still follow through with the vintage. But the main thing is Cabernet, main grape on the left bank. Cabernet Franc, you see it a little bit more on the right bank. It's not as late ripening as Cabernet, so you can usually still get those grapes at a ripe enough point, even on these cool clay soils, and it kind of brings the structure in a different way. It's more about acidity. Just really quickly on the right bank, it's usually like 70% Merlot, blended with about 30 or so percent Cabernet Franc. Cabernet Franc is usually known for its herbaceousness. Petit Verdot, you're starting to see more and more plantings. This is one of the later harvested varieties, so not a lot of it, but it gives color and extraction. And with global warming, we might see more of that. I might just move on past this. I kept these here, but these are all your grapes used for the white wines of Bordeaux. If you were to produce a white wine from the Medoc, you would have to release it as a lower designation, just like Bordeaux AOP. Because Margaux is for red wine, Pauillac is for red wine, Saint Estephe, Saint Julien, all for red wine, even Medoc red wine. But Bordeaux, this larger appellation that encompasses all of Bordeaux region, you can produce red, white, and rosé. So if you're Chateau Margaux and you want to release a white wine, because they do, and it's expensive, it's called Pavillon Blanc de Chateau Margaux. They just have to release it as like Bordeaux AOP or IGP Atlantique. A little interesting there about 7 grapes that are going to be permitted due to global warming, but this is more for the outlying Bordeaux and Bordeaux Superior designations. This is how they grow the grapes. So they call this the double goyot. Sometimes you might want a permanent cane, but you can see here that they kind of cut them off every year or so. And the reason for that is because you do have this disease pressure. So you're less susceptible to those diseases from having like a new cane every other year that bears fruit. You usually will have this double goyot, meaning these 2 temporary canes on the left bank. On the right bank, you'll use a single goyot, which is just one single temporary cane as opposed to a permanent one that's going to be removed every other year that will bear fruit. The reason why it's single on the right bank is because it helps reduce vigor. Merlot can grow a lot and can do it very, very quickly. And that's why it helps to be tamed by cool clay soils, and also the way that they train the vine, reducing vigor through the single cane versus the double cane. So turn, they like to use a permanent cane. It's just smaller berries that helps with the development of botrytis. These temporary canes, you get larger berries. Just a little bit about that. And relatively high density planting, 7,000 vines per hectare. It's usually like a meter by meter, if you look at it that way. And that's similar to what they have in Burgundy. But what the point of that is again, the closer they are together, the more they have to compete with their neighbor to search for that water underneath the soil type. So it allows for those roots to grow deep and really get strong vines that produce concentrated fruit. So they recognize that, well, this maritime influence area, what are ways that you can build concentration? Well, one way is you can get the vines to compete with each other, and you do that by planting them closer together, meter by meter. And this is like standard appellations, and then you might see more or less. And then this general move towards away from chemical herbicides and fertilizers. It's a big, big thing going on here, and you're seeing it. I feel like you're seeing it more rapidly here than other areas. And then increasing organic farming. The one thing that they had to do to avoid this fungal diseases, like what we saw even beginning in the late 1800s, like powdery mildew and downy mildew, is that they came up with this Bordeaux mixture, which is just a spray of copper sulfate, lime, and water. Copper sulfate is permitted, this Bordeaux mixture, in organic farming, but it stays in the vineyard site. So a lot of people are really drawing back on the use of these, or trying to consider other ways of preventing fungal diseases without the use of this copper that has previously helped in mitigating fungal issues. And another way of doing that is leaf stripping, just pulling the leaves off the canopy to allow for aeration through the vines. And Potecanet, again, our first biodynamic producer, classified 5th growth of Bordeaux, became officially certified in 2010. And then here we have about 600 organic producers. I believe this is all in all of Bordeaux. 47 are biodynamic. But there's other efforts going towards environmental practices. And I think in 2019, Saint-Emilion, that requires all of their classified, or all of their, I forget if it's classified estates or just all of their estates, move towards some sort of sustainable farming. And it doesn't necessarily have to be organic, but it's like a relationship where they're monitoring their progress and move towards, I guess, more of a green earth. Vinification, so they're farming double goyot, so you don't have these permanent canes. You like to plant them close together. A lot of this is a move towards sustainable and organic farming. We all want healthy grapes. It's just like you all want healthy food, right? Be mindful of what you want to put in your body, I guess. Selection in the vineyard. So why is this Chateau so great? Because they're very selective in their fruit, and the way that they're so selective in the fruit starts in the vineyards, right? They're hand harvest. There is a mechanical harvesting that's taking place where they use your tractors to go and pick the grapes, but usually in these top quality regions, everything is hand harvested, and that's a way of just pulling in the top quality fruit that's just most selected. And another way of building concentration, if it's just not planting density is that you do green harvesting. So come in like late September, August, it's like this ideal ripening time they call veraison, where all the extra sugars from the leaves shoot to the stems and to the grapes themselves. Well, right what they do is they'll go through the vineyards and they'll drop some of the grape clusters. So those sugars are going to less clusters. So those remaining fruit on the vine, after other clusters are dropped, they get that extra sugar, and that's where you build ripeness and concentration. So for a while, you'd even hear people in Napa like, oh man, I cut all this fruit, like really limiting their yields, the amount that they produce. But that tells you quality. Like, I produce so little because I, green harvested everything. Now I get this really concentrated wine. I think there's some conversation about producers stepping away from it. There's other ways of balancing the life cycle of the vine. So if it's not selection in the vineyard, even with green harvesting, once you pick those vines, pick those grapes, because we are making the wines now, vinification, they can also sort their fruit through optical sorters. Again, these are Château that have a lot of money, and they can just like zap out through lasers some of these grapes that perhaps don't meet the size or other regulations that this machine can detect. So optical sorting, and they also have density sorting, where they put the grapes in like a sugar water solution. And if the grapes are ripe enough where they have more sugar than the solution that's put in, it'll sink to the bottom. The ones that aren't ripe enough with not enough sugar, they'll float to the top. So they'll remove all the less ripe fruit with less sugars that float to the top, and they'll keep the best from the bottom. So another way of selecting fruit. Destemming, you hear about this in Burgundy with Pinot Noir, a whole cluster where they want to ferment the grapes with the cluster itself. It's a way of building backbone and texture, but with very tannic grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon, you're usually going to destem the fruit before you make the wines. And then they're playing around with a wide variety of vats that they'll use to make the wines. Sometimes they'll ferment in stainless steel to control temperatures. A new practice only brought to the world in like the 70s. Concrete does that as well. It's a kind of more regulated, controlled way of fermenting the wines, which gives you safe fermentation. And then wood. We see a lot of new wood, especially for top cuvées. I'll see a lot of French oak, because those flavors of toastiness and creaminess and sweet spice from oak can be a wonderful complement from this Cabernet Merlot blends grown on these top gravel mounds where they do get ripeness of fruit. Remontage and pigeage. Oh boy, I hope you're doing well. This is pumping over. You could just kind of punch down the cap of the fruits when it's fermenting. It's a more gradual process, but a lot of people like to use remontage, which is pumping over. It's kind of like a less delicate way. I've heard it both ways, but I feel like it's a less delicate way. It's a way of breaking down the cap that forms from the skins and the stems of the must that allows for a better extraction. But most people use punch over. Hey, I don't mean to get stuck on this. This is kind of fun because you always hear about malolactic fermentation, but a lot of people didn't even know what that was. Most red wines will go through it. Some whites do, Chardonnay being the one that goes through it most often. But post-fermentation is that conversion of malic acids, tart green acids, into lactic acids. So it softens out the wines and makes it more approachable. And it was Emile Pinot, the famous enologist consultant of Bordeaux, throughout the 20th centuries, and only started really kind of teaching people about this process of malic, or identifying it, again, like 40, 50 years ago, not that long. And they could do that through controlling the fermentation. If they kickstart the heat a little bit, it'll help kind of get that process of converting tart green malic acids into creamy soft lactic acids. And it'll happen pretty quick. So what happens is they'll ferment the wines maybe in October or November, but then they'll let the wine go through malolactic right afterwards. Sometimes other areas of the world, it'll just happen on its own, casually, in its more natural environment. But they want to get it going right away, because they'll put it in a vessel. Then in December and January, they'll rack it into barrels for the first time. And then in March or spring, they may rack it again. They'll do so, I don't know, for this in premier tasting. And that's where people try the future Bordeaux's, which will then, where all your writers and people in the industry will taste these wines from the last harvest. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like what Robert Parker did. Like, this is going to be amazing. This is going to be the best one, or I'm not sure yet. But they want these wines to show them their best at that point of spring after harvest. And the way they can do that, or they want to accomplish that, is ensuring that it goes through malolactic conversion. And they're not trying to let those wines do that randomly in like spring, like March or April. So what do they do? These things do. And then they're typically aged about 2 years before release. So when people are, these wine writers are giving scores to these new wines, they're seeing it before it's even being, they're giving those scores before they're even released in the market, because they still have about 18 to 24 months where those producers might only bottle or even create their blends maybe right before that in-premier tasting in spring, or a while afterwards. So they're basing these scores on a lot of like just maybe wines that aren't complete. We could say it that way. But anyway, Médoc. So this is the big, larger area. Can be applied to any wine on the peninsula. The northernmost, this is our light tan. This is specifically for Médoc. Okay. As a cooler area, just like Saint Estephe, might be better. And these are your value Bordeaux. I can imagine most of them you could buy between 15 and 25 retail. In a warm vintage where everybody had ripe fruit, so inexpensive or not, warm vintage, successful harvest, that's the time to try some of these maybe lesser known wines from lesser known regions. And dry vintages, because this is a cool area. So if other areas were even worried about drought, well, there's more moisture and humidity in the air and also in the soils, where these folks probably did pretty well. So I guess there's a couple ways you could approach that. Previously known as Bas Médoc, the lower Médoc, lower elevation, but you don't want to put that because they don't usually do that anymore. I think they quit doing that in the 30s and 40s, but they don't want that to represent like an inferior wine compared to the Haut Médoc. And then just higher clay and limestone as opposed to gravel. You can see a decent size here, about close to 6,000 hectares, where a lot of these are batting around like 1,000 hectares. They're pretty small, only about 440 growers. And then just if you want to try to generalize, slightly more rustic, just easier day drinking wines, you know? And that's what most people in France drink. That's what they think of when they drink Bordeaux. It's not always these top estates. It's like, oh, this is what I'm going to drink for dinner. And just how the vineyards are laid out, you can see because of this clay limestone, more the influence of the Atlantic, you might see more Merlot. And then moving on to the Haut Médoc, or High Médoc, closer to the town of Bordeaux, just moving up higher in elevation. Again, this outlying area. There are 5 Cru Class A classified growth actually located in the Haut Médoc, just meaning outside of our 4 major communes. Those are probably the most value priced Château. And being a larger area, you might see a more mix of soils. Again, it's why these are so prized is because this is where the gravel mounds are more prevalent. There are 4 major communes, and then you'll see that maybe throughout, but it's more varied and perhaps not as high of quality for that reason. Although you are up at higher elevation sites, it's not very high. I mean, this is 40 meters, so this is all pretty. It's like pretty low lying. This is areas that also used to be covered by water multiple times over history. But it's just these little pockets of gravel that kind of pop up throughout, but it never gets to be very high. Like Burgundy, again, I throw this out there just as like a main wine region. The top vineyard sites of Burgundy, like Grand Crus, are at that like 250, 275 meters. And that's not super high. This, at some of the highest elevation sites, you're only at like 30 meters tops. Haut Médoc having some of the higher ones at 40 meters, which could be good for drainage. Probably the most useful aspect or practical aspect when looking at Haut Médoc. A little bit less as far as the amount of hectares that are planted than what we saw in the Médoc. and again, about 400 growers. Some of these growers have parcels in both of these areas, so it kind of overlaps because we only have about 600 growers total in Medoc. And there are a lot of co-ops that exist in this area. So a lot of these growers will sell their fruit to these larger co-ops and where they'll finally be made. And then maybe just not quite the fruit or ripeness that we'll find from our more prized communes close to the river on our gravel soils. Maybe that's why they describe it as more rustic. And while we still see a higher percentage of Merlot, just getting away from the gravel soils that define the more reputable regions. Château Latour Carnet, just maybe one producer, finding reference in different resources. This is a fourth growth, so this is one of the Cru Classes in this area. It's cool that it's one of the oldest chateaux in the entire Medoc, and this was built in the 12th century. Some of these chateaux might have existed too. I mean, it happened before even the Dutch drained this area in the 1600s, but some of them might have actually been established with different like agricultural practices. Like I think like Lafitte had been around for a long time, but it was really just established as like a livestock farm. But anyway, so one of these lesser known chateaux, classified gross, still number 4 out of 5, a big deal. What's maybe cool about trying it as a value option is knowing a little bit about its history. It's been around for over 800, 900 years, 1100s. This Société Anomalée is located right above the border of Saint Estephe. So it'd be like right in here. This is always recommended and brought up as far as value chateau in the Alt-Medoc region. That doesn't fit into this classification. So I may just leave it at that right now, but remember Société Anomalée. And then you will discover sometimes that these top estates and the major communes, they own multiple properties and they might have some chateau located in the Alt-Medoc. So it's like, who do I try first? Well, Latour Carnet has this historic background. Okay, cool. I heard about Société Anomalée. Oh, I heard about one of my favorite first girls. So they actually own a property in the Alt-Medoc, so that when they're making the wines, they have the same resources and maybe have value that way. This is 7:31. I knew where we're at. I'm gonna be about 10 more minutes. So I hope you're okay. Hope this is all right. So now we're in the major communes. We did it. So this is Saint Estephe, the one furthest north, the one less protected by the lawn forest, more influenced by the Atlantic. We only have, there are 5 total classified gross. There are no first. We have kind of like 2 super second. Usually the one that's most people's favorites is this Côte d'Esternol. I actually believe you pronounce the S here. Usually you don't in French, but this is Côte d'Esternol. And this commune is only divided from Pauillac, from this Jai, that little drainage channel or stream that kind of puts a dip into the vineyard areas or the land that defines these 2 areas. But you can see that Côte d'Esternol as a second growth is right across this Jai, this stream from Lafitte Rothschild, which is a first growth. So it's all about proximity sometimes. I'm going to show you this real quick too. If we go south, move from Côte d'Esternol and from Saint Julien into Pauillac, where we have Lafitte right across the border, one of the other first growths of Pauillac, besides Lafitte, is Latour. Latour on the far south. So these 2, Lafitte, Latour, first growths of Pauillac, kind of the bookends of the appellation. Latour, you can see it's right by the water, some of the deepest gravel soils. And sometimes you get this more austere, more powerful example of wine from where these grapes are grown next to the temperate area by the water. So Latour, another little thing. Lafitte is gravel on top of limestone, so it's usually a little bit prettier and lighter. Latour is gravel on top of clay, also bringing power and richness. So Latour, power and richness. Lafitte, elegance, gravel, limestone, gravel on top of clay. But they talk about Montrose sharing a similar position next to the water. You see how close that is? Where it sometimes can have a more power and structure, even the way that Latour can in the different commune further south. Higher proportion of clay, a little bit more Merlot. And yeah, we have these 2 second growths. Hey, if you ever hear about the 1976 Judgment of Paris, where best of California beat out the best of France, one of the French properties to participate in that was Montrose. So it's still, it's still highly recognized. Third growth, Cologne Segura, furthest north, is the northernmost classified growth in all of Médoc. So being having a little more clay, might be a little bit prettier sometimes. And when all these chateaux were officially being established, a lot of them were under same ownership before they eventually became divided. And it was the guy who owned Lafitte and Latour also owns Cologne Segura. He married into the Segura family. So even though this is a third growth, you probably have heard the story. Valentine's Day is right around the corner. He'd always say, I make my wine at Lafitte and Latour, but my heart belongs to Cologne Segura. So you have the same owner with the same resources, putting maybe his best efforts into a lower classified growth, and that's Cologne Segura. But further north, just think clay soils, lighter styles, but maybe if they ever experienced a drought or really dry conditions, because it can still happen. Where's an area that these grapes had a little better access to water, while in these cool clay soils further north. So Cologne Segura, maybe in hotter vintage, could be a great, again, option for sneaking on quality. A lot of cru Bourgeois up here, because we don't have a lot of classified estates. Here's a quick list at some of them. Cologne Segura, de Pez. De Pez, same ownership of Louis Roederer, the famous champagne house, who are also moving towards biodynamic. And then even Château Meunier underneath. I have all these notes. I might share some of my notes on some of these certain chateau towards maybe tomorrow with the lineup, just because of a risk of time. Maybe to keep it that way. But sometimes, same ownership, and you see that a lot. And then this is just to zoom in. This is all from Jancis Robinson's Atlas. And it might seem a little kind of crazy at first, I guess, but you see the jai that divides Saint Estephe from Pauillac. But you can then see your major chateau and see where they're located. And you can see that they're at a slightly higher elevation. Again, when these areas, it's kind of like these just little hills and slopes, and rather otherwise pretty low-lying land, that you can get drainage, and that will work well for these Cabernet grapes. So you can see Cologne Segura, Montrose, Sternal, Col Laborie, 5th growth, and I think Lafon Rocher, 4th growth, and then right across the river you can see Lafitte. And then this is a look at close to Sternal. This producer was heavily influenced by his time in Asia, so they actually have this pagodos as opposed to chateau, and some of this influence in its interior design, what it might look like if you were to go and tour the vineyards. And then you can see, I make my wines at Lafitte and Latour, but my heart, which you see on the label, belongs to 3rd growth, Cologne Segura. So Pauillac, power, deepest gravel mounds. So Cabernet making up the majority of the blends. We have 3 of the 5 first growths. Hey guys, chat real quick. I've never tried Lafitte. I've never tried Latour. They could totally be once in a lifetime wines, because they're going to be $1,000 on a wine list most times, easily. Which one's going to be lighter, Lafitte or Latour? I'll let you write the answer in chat. And then here, Mouton, elevated in 1973. They're actually on a similar plateau, and they call it the Lafitte Plateau and the Mouton Plateau, but it's at some of the deeper gravel mounds. And both of these top estates, it's a very, very high percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon for their Grand Vin, their top wine, where it makes about 90% of the blends. And that's because of the plateau that these 2 estates are located on. Mouton also owns Darmelac right below, so even though it's a 5th growth, here we share the same ownership, which is pretty cool. What else can I say? Lynch Bage, this is one of the super second 5th growths, doing really well for themselves as far as like the last so many years of quality. And then we have a couple super seconds down here to the Pichon Longueville Comtesse de Lalonde, and also Pichon Longueville Baron right across. there's a road that you would drive up through these communes if you're leaving Bordeaux. It's the D2, and I believe both of these are just located right on either side of the D2, this road that you drive up through these vineyards. Oh, you want to know another one real quick? No, I'm gonna wait. I have one more to get through. It's Pauillac, so another way of looking at that if we were to look at our Jancis Robinson Atlas. But here's a look at their label. It's Lafitte to the north, lighter gravel over limestone, the answer. Latour, gravel over clay, fuller. And then this is the Picasso label from Mouton that was elevated in 73. And then this is Saint Julien. This is where you actually have the most gravel located. And I actually think they actually, you know, you find different things, different areas, but I actually think they have more Cabernet planted here because this is actually, it's not the deepest gravel mounds, but it's the most gravel. It's the way that that's usually characterized. It's the smallest appellation, no first grows, but they talk about 85%. I've heard higher numbers than that of these vineyards actually belong to the Château. So the thing that would always be tied with Saint Julien, if they would say top sommelier is, if you could drink wine from any commune of Bordeaux for the rest of your life, where would you drink it from? Saint Julien, because even though it doesn't have any first grows, the majority of these vineyards belong to these classified chateaux. So you're always gonna usually have a high level of quality, and that's due to the consistency of gravel soils that you find here. And then I think we also have 5 second grows. So a lot of second grows, even though there are no first. A lot of them are these Lievels broken down here on the one side. There's Poifer, Barton, and actually Lievel Las Casas is over here as well. So it's the Lievels on the one side. You also have Ducu Bucayu, it's a super second. The other number 5 in our number of second gross would be Gruard Laros further inland, closer to the border of Saint Julien before you get to these outlying areas. There's I'm gonna go to the next one. Only 19 growers, super seconds. Chateau Gloria is also owned by, I'm gonna go to this. See this? Make you guys squint your eyes really hard at the last part of class. See this Gruard Laros? Oh, that's not what I want. Chateau Gloria, it's an unclassified estate, but it's actually owned by Chateau Saint Pierre, which is a classified 4th growth. And all the wines is under same ownership, but the winemaking facility is actually Gloria. So they make both of these wines at Chateau Gloria. So usually people, when they want to find value of Saint Julien, Gloria is a top pick for many of them. And it's kind of fun that the wines of Chateau Saint Pierre are actually also made at Chateau Gloria, even though it's unclassified. And here's, see, there's how the Lievels eventually got broken up. Well, there's Lievel Barton and there's Langoa Barton. And these are also under the same ownership. And the wines, even though Langoa Barton is a 4th growth, Lievel Barton is a 2nd growth, the wines are actually made at Langoa Barton. And these wines are made the exact same way. So sometimes maybe an area not as highly talked about as far as like expresses of terroir, even though it's a big part, it's still a part of conversation and the way that these wines drank stylistically. But it's kind of a cool thing. I've never done it. Again, these would be a little expensive to try, but Lievel Barton and Langoa Barton under the same ownership, made the exact same way, but can taste, I've been told, pretty differently from each other. So it's kind of a cool thing to maybe explore or try out. Maybe just to leave it at that. Okay, and then we're getting into, before we get to Margaux, oh, I'm keeping you 5 more minutes. I'm sorry. Hope you're all right, but we're learning so much, I hope. Listrac, on the fringe, that's literally what it means, on the edge of things. It's actually some of the higher elevation sites within all of Medoc, and it's known to have sandier soils, sandier usually producing lighter expressions. And it used to be one of the major white wine production areas of Bordeaux until it was replanted. You know, it does have a, you know, it is adaptable region. All the way up until the 1970s, I think it was like 60% of all Bordeaux was planted with white grapes. Now, over this transition of time, perhaps due to Robert Parker and all of these areas of the golden age of Bordeaux, it's like 90% of all Bordeaux is red. So that's a huge transition again in a 40%, in a 50 year period of time. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, Merlot dominant, 74 growers, not as much planted, 567. But just think of lighter styles, higher elevation. I might just leave it at that right now. Define more by sand, why there's more Merlot. Oh, this doesn't mean fringe. This means mill. One thing I have to correct. Moulis, it means mills, because there used to be a lot of windmills. Might even think of, if you're Bourgeois fans, Moulin Avant. But there's a higher percentage of gravel here versus Listrac. So again, no classified growths, but good value and better vintages. Still Merlot dominant. Château Châteauxs, it's always one of the top producers kind of mentioned when learning about Moulis and Médoc appellation. And if it's not Château Châteauxs, Château Pujol, again, based on this gravel outcrop. Gravel outcrop is also known as Pujol, and the fact, maybe a little testament to their farming moving towards biodynamic practices. In Margaux, once we move past Listrac and Moulis, and we've tried wines from Châteauxs and Pujol, we're in Margaux. I think it was Ernest Hemingway's wife. She changed her spelling of her name from Margaux, M-A-R-G-O-T, to the commune of Margaux, the way that's spelled, M-A-R-G-U-X, because she loved the wines of Margaux so much. And I guess it's one of the most popular names for French women, is Margaux. But it's the largest commune in the Médoc, and it has these 5 communes that are within it. Soussan to the north, Margaux, Cantenac, these are where most chateaux are located, right around the town of Margaux. You also have Labard, and you also have Arsac. Arsac further inland, it's also at higher elevation. The one classified growth located over here in Arsac is Château de Tours. And they're ones known for advancements and experimenting with different winemaking using like concrete vessels and things along those lines. I think they might even be employing biodynamics, but it's more about how their advancements in winemaking, and they're willing to experiment with different methods. But just remember that it's elegant, it's pretty, gravel still dominant, but it's the fact that this fine gravel that creates these lighter styles, and the fact that it's over perhaps a subsoil of clay. And you have the most growths here, but it's only one top estate, Chateau Margaux. And then you have a number of third growths. One of them is Chateau Palmer, who's recognized as a first growth in our Live X classification, but can be very, very expensive. This Rosson Segla is one that also, it is a second growth, but it's also owned by Chanel. For any of you fashion people out there, this is also making killer wines in Margaux. I guess in Margaux, they talk, I think, a little bit more about a strong subsoil of clay, producing more powerful examples, if it happens to be some of these estates located here. In the commune of Cantenac, again, all within Margaux, it's slightly more sand. So if you have one from Desmorel or Curon, maybe more sand, they might be lighter expressions than some of these estates like Chateau Perrier or Marquis de Saint. That might be more powerful. And this is Chateau Margaux itself. We're gonna go and take a picture outside of the gates, see the label. And then we're almost there, you guys. Hopefully this has been kind of fun. And thanks for being patient listeners. You know, we try to accomplish a lot. There's always so much more that you'd like to include, but I'll just have that with tomorrow's outline, things I would like to share. But there are some producers playing around with white wines. Margaux's Pavillon Blanc de Chateau Margaux I mentioned earlier, which is the richest Sauvignon Blanc. I just put that because I saw it written that way somewhere, and I thought it was kind of funny, but it can be expensive. Again, it would just have to be released as a designation other than Margaux or Médoc if it's just Bordeaux. Lynch-Bage does one. You can see these are kind of newer ventures. Mouton Rothschild, to compete with Margaux's Pavillon, does this L d'Argent. Lagrange, our fourth growth, releases a Blanc, and so on and so on. Just a little bit about how Bordeaux as a whole is broken down. you know, so much is exported, but 60% of Medoc is exported, all of our famous estates at a slightly higher level. And certainly even like 2008 and on, it was the Asian market. China's up there as Bordeaux took a dip in perhaps other areas like the United States or what have you. China was one place that it really gained popularity. And then there used to be that documentary Red Obsession that I don't know, I bring up sometimes. And then we talked a little bit about in premier sales. It's that tasting in the springtime where they give scores to the future releases of Bordeaux, which might dictate price. And then from that point on, the Chateau that sell to the courtiers, the in-between guys, will then sell to negociants. And the negociants, maybe based off these price, off these scores, will release the wines in a series of what they call tranches. And if you buy the wines in the first tranche, you might get it at the lowest price point. And then from there, it might determine the price of the second release, the second tranche, and then they might have a third and a fourth. I'll stop there. Second wines, remember this. Like Chateau Palmer has Alter Ego as one of the more memorable ones. But when these Chateau are so out of reach as far as price point, like I can't, if unless I'm working at a super fancy restaurant like 11 Madison Park or something like that, I don't get to try these wines, and many of us don't get to drink these wines on a regular basis. But how starting in the 80s, not only with the advent of these Grand Vin and high scores and rising prices, it was also to the efforts of Emile Pinard. If you remember him when I brought up malolactic fermentation, he was that enologist that also can help convince a lot of Chateau to release a second wine. So you're only releasing like top fruit into your top Grand Vin to keep that at a high level of quality. But second labels have kind of caught on to something else other than just like the young vines of the state, or perhaps the parcels of the vineyards or certain casts that maybe wasn't necessarily fit for the Grand Vin. They would be released under this other second wine. Now a certain Chateau actually have separate plots completely set aside, meant for their second wines. But a lot of, gosh, our list is almost too heavy in some of these second labels, if it wouldn't be from some of these second or third growths, because you just see the most value that are behind it, and that can all drink very, very well. And it's a newer thing that really only started to take place in the last 30, 40 years, these second wines of these classified estates, but where you can find some of the most value. If you're looking at this in front of you, the last 5 years have been really pretty warm. There was a frost in 17, but affected areas a little bit heavier outside of the Medoc. But most of these vintages have been pretty ripe and warm. They don't have those worries of the 60s and 70s of just like an inadequate harvest because of too much moisture or cool conditions. So these will all drink relatively ripe and big. Oh my gosh, what happened to my 16? Hey, I do always throw this out there, but it's just an easy thing to remember, and it's kind of true. Like just Jancis Robinson would say, whatever's divisible by 5. So if it's 10, if it's 15, 10, 5, 0, 85, they're all pretty good. So if you forget about some of these things in front of you, because it might just it's not always consistent, and sometimes you find things in different resources. But 16, people that represent these wines, they talk about that as being the wine to collect. So I don't know what the heck I did with my 16 here, but 2016, I think even more than 15, people have been most excited about its potential, and maybe one worth collecting. And maybe you can't pay the money for that really expensive Chateau. You might be able to find the second wine, because you know that's going to be really, really good too. So that's another way of approaching it, right? And it just kind of it just depends on what wine styles you like to drink and what's good to you. You know, if you like bigger, fuller, maybe even more like New World style wines, or if you like California wines, they're a little riper and fuller, you might like wines from some of these warmer vintages. If you're used to drinking Italian wines like Sangiovese that are dry and structured and maybe more reserved, you might enjoy some of these wines from some of the cooler years. And honestly, like so with some of these tap chateau, a lot of times they are going to be just making extraordinary wines. So certain years might be at certain points in accreditations, but people that get to taste these wines a lot and return to these vintages, maybe even off vintage or lesser, lower scored vintages, they can be a lot of people's favorites. It might not even have the ageability where some of these can easily go 20, 30 years. Depends again what you like. But again, maybe a place to um, approach how you buy and find value, I suppose. Like, oh, 14 is $100 less per bottle than the 15 on this one chateau. Well, I mean, it can be quite a bit of difference in costs. That might be the time to buy. Oh gosh, these are our wines. Sorry, it's been an hour and a half class for you tonight. This is Parabon. So this is Alt-Medoc property. And then 09 is one of the more successful vintages, like 2010. 9, I think, is a little bit softer. 10 is a little bit more structured. So that softer quality of the 9, still ripe, might be better at an earlier time, like today, with 13 years of age behind it. 10, maybe you want to lay down a little bit. And to try a wine from an outlying region, Cru Bourgeois, from an exceptional vintage. And then what we learn about it is a 250-year-old estate. It did petition to be Bordeaux classification, but as just didn't make it at the time, but doesn't seem to deter them from their reputation over that period, I suppose. And then a lot of it is just due to current investment in care and attendance to the facilities and making sure that they have the top resources available for when they're making these wines and they're making them the best way possible. And then, oh, okay, it's in the Alt-Medoc, but it's right on the border of Pauillac. So again, it's about location. And then a little look at their breakdown, how they're aged. So that's Alt-Medoc, Cru Bourgeois, lesser known Chateau, but from an exceptional year. This is a classified 5th growth Chateau Grand Puy du Cos. Located, the chateau itself is right on the water or right on the outskirts of the town of Pauillac. And it's one of the few chateaux where their vineyards actually located outside of the estate itself, where some of the vineyards are located to the north of Pauillac and some to just the west, the town of itself. Takes its name from a low gravelly hill, but eventually became its own estate. It was classified as kind of funny as known as their Tigarnaud, but then changed its name back in honor of the founders. And oh, this is fun too. So you learn about who's helping consult and who's making the wines. This Hubert Dubois, in 2013, the owners brought him on as a consultant. He also makes wine for Chateau Angelus of Saint-Emilion, one of the top estates over there. So it's, again, you're sharing the same winemakers of some of the most regarded estates that are out there. And then you also have this technical director, Anne Lenoir. See some awesome ladies and their influence. Did everybody sign out? Like, no way, I gotta go. I drank my Bordeaux and I'm tired. I got a dog who's watching. It's not just family hanging around drinking. That's cool. It's cool to see everybody together for this stuff. And a dog named Shannon. Well, you guys didn't mean to go over. We try to always be aware every time, but I think
Thanks, Ryan.
we try to. We got 2 dogs. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody just love Bordeaux? Any things they'd like to share with themselves? A little hand up. It's not so bad. It's one of the great wine regions of the world. We have some people that are really trying their best to keep things moving forward and adapting to just accomplishing the purpose of making the best wines they can. Okay. Well, thanks for bearing with me. And then we're going to head over to Saint-Emilion and then head on to the Graz, and we're all going to be on our way to Bordeaux experts. Maybe I'd like to help you along in that process. Hopefully you get a lot out of these classes. We'll let you go. And you can always ask me questions through emails. I don't really see that too often, but you can. And you'll have my email, but you can ask questions at any time. And then hopefully you again just had a good time and maybe learned a few things. And makes you want to keep drinking or trying more Bordeaux, I suppose. But it's been fun for us. So thank you very much. I hope that's shared with all of you. We'll let you get going.
Thank you, Ryan. Good class.
Yeah, always. Gosh, it's good
Bye.
to see you, you know. Have a good night.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hope you have a nice dinner to enjoy with these wines. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.